Hi, I'm Joan Urschler, the director of the Waisman Early Childhood Program, and I want to welcome you to the Early Childhood Seminar Series. And today we have an exceptional speaker, Brittany Travers, and she's in the Department of Kinesiology in the OT department. And interestingly, her work is multidisciplinary. She combines brain development with daily living skills in children with autism. And she is a wonderful parent in the early childhood program too, just so you know. Okay, Brittany.
Thanks so much, Joan. It's really exciting to be here because I see, having been in the building for quite a few years, I see people from all different aspects of my life, from those who I, drop my son off with every day and who take great care of him, and people who I've worked with in brain imaging. So thank you guys so much for being here today. It's really exciting. So I wanted to just tell you that this work is hopefully going to be published next week in Developmental Science, so this is kind of a preview of it, but I also have some additional analyses that we've done that I would like to show you at the very end, and I'll let you know when we get to those, because those are not peer-reviewed yet. Those are hot off the press. But as I'm giving this talk, I would really like to hear your feedback and your input, especially with this very interdisciplinary audience. I feel that you guys have a lot of insights into this work that I might just kind of have blind spots to. So if at any point in time you guys want to speak up and have a question or a point of clarification, that would be great. But then also at the end, I'll be eliciting your feedback into different ways of trying to explain why we see these particular patterns that we keep seeing in our data. So with that said, I'm going to be talking to you today about hand skill development and daily living skills in people with autism spectrum disorder, really across the lifespan. In this work, these are my amazing co-authors, so this is collaborative work with people here at the Waisman Center, and then also people at the University of Utah, Brigham Young University, and Harvard as well. And I feel like I should, especially talking to a lot of clinicians in the audience, I feel like I should always have a disclaimer that my background is in experimental psychology, but I am, as Joan said, in the occupational therapy program in the Department of Kinesiology. So in some ways, I'm a psychologist fish out of water in the OT department, and always trying to, learn the different perspectives. So, I feel like at the beginning of every talk that I give, I use this slide, but I find it very useful. If you've seen this before, humor me. But this is kind of my research framework of why I study motor skills in autism, because as you can imagine, being a person who studies motor skills in autism, a lot of people say, why do you do that? We have these social communication difficulties, we have these repetitive behaviors, so why study the motor skills? And for me, there's a couple of basic assumptions for why I do this. And the first one is that each and every one of us has this brain that allows us to interact with the world around us and react to the world around us by allowing us to gain these motor skills really across the lifespan. So learning how to crawl, then learning how to walk, learning to run, to sprint. These things change with our brain over the course of the lifespan and really enable us to do a number of things in our daily life that give us these independent living skills. So really my research looks at this type of framework in terms of autism. We think of autism as a neurodevelopmental disorder. We still don't fully understand the neural mechanisms involved in autism. But we know that there are changes in the brain that occur as a result of having autism. And what I'm looking at is how these brain changes relate to motor ability across the lifespan using this kind of developmental lens. And then also how motor ability affects daily life and independent living in individuals with autism. So I really see motor skills as at this important intersection between what's happening in the brain. So it could be a potential window into some of the brain mechanisms in autism. But it's also at this intersection of just our daily life and what we're doing and the skills that we need to kind of get those independent living skills down. So some of the work that I've been doing has also been looking at different ways that could we possibly change some of the neural mechanisms through behavioral means to have cascading effects on this. I'm not going to be presenting that work today, but if you guys have any questions about that, I'd be happy to answer questions at the end as well. So motor difficulties in autism were actually reported in the first case study of autism by Leo Connor. There's this interesting description that was particularly provided by one mother who said that picking up her 18-month-old with autism was like picking up a sack of flour, because the child was not making any of the postural adjustments to his mother that a lot of typically developing children start to develop even around 3 to 4 months of age. And so he also reported motor clumsiness in a number of these individuals as well. And I say a number, but not all of them, because we do know that there's diversity in these motor difficulties across the autism spectrum, some of which I'll be showing you here today. We also know that motor difficulties were actually part of the early diagnostic core features of autism, although these were later removed by the DSM-IV. More recent research suggests that motor difficulties, and these are a diversity of motor difficulties, from difficulties with grip strength, postural stability difficulties, dyspraxia, these are highly prevalent in people with autism. A study by Ming and colleagues looked at charts, healthcare charts of people with autism, and found that over half of the children with autism had motor difficulties. We also know from recent studies that motor difficulties are correlated with autism symptom severity, and this is actually how I got into this line of research. I was looking for a measure of motor ability that I could just kind of control for the motor ability of my sample, but then come to find out that was the piece that was correlated with the social communication and the repetitive behaviors that we were seeing in our sample. So knowing their postural stability was able to tell me where they might be in terms of their social symptoms and repetitive behavior symptoms at the individual level. And that's something that's been replicated and seen by a number of different labs. We've also been able to show that with grip strength as well. So we know that motor difficulties are present in people with autism, but one of the things is it's not clear how motor skills actually develop in individuals with autism over time, and whether motor impairments actually impact daily life in people with autism. So there are just a couple of studies that have looked at motor development, and I'll be talking about those today. And all of them kind of converge on two main findings. The first one is that motor ability seems to improve with age in people with autism, just like it does in people with typical development. So the Ming study that I told you about on the last slide found that there was fewer reported motor difficulties in the medical charts of the adolescents compared to those children who they studied. But the research suggests that the gaps in motor development between people with autism and typical development actually widen with age. And so motor skills become less and less typical from 12 to 36 months of age in people with autism. And we also know that there was increased group differences in postural control with age from 5 to 52 years of age. And I'm going to actually show you a graph of that from the Minshew and colleagues paper. So here what you see, let's see if I can get this going here. On the x-axis we have age from 5 to 52, and on the y-axis we have our measure of postural control. And so higher levels is better postural control than lower levels. And the O's are the people with autism, and the crosses or the plus signs are the people with typical development. And what you see is that the group with autism starts pretty similar to the group with typical development, but these gaps widen and widen over time with age, so starting about in the early 20s. And this has also been shown in finger tapping speed and grip strength by the same authors. And here we have age on the x-axis again, and this is our finger tapping speed measure. And here we show that the gaps are widening over time, and same with grip strength. So I feel like with this audience, I don't really have to oversell the fact that manual motor performance really affects us in our daily life. Actually, even putting these slides together, I was thinking about how challenging this would be if I did have manual motor difficulties, resizing different things, putting in little animations, typing the little notes that I was doing. But we use our hands really across the lifespan. So infants are using their hands to explore the world, to explore the other people in their world, to grasp objects. I think about my son, who's 2.5, who was using his hands to zip up his coat today, and how proud he was of that moment. So really, we use our hands on a daily, if not moment-to-moment basis. So I'm going to change gears real quick and talk about some of the research of Leanne Smith, Matt Maynor, and Marcia Malik, who really showed how there are these different developmental trajectories for adaptive daily living skills in people with autism compared to people with Down syndrome. So here what you see is we have on the x-axis age in years, and this is the Waisman Activities of Daily Living scale. And it is a scale from 0 to 34, and 34 means that you have more independence in your adaptive daily living skills, whereas 0 or lower numbers means that you have limited independence. And these are things like toileting, dressing, and other adaptive daily living tasks. So the blue line is the individuals with autism without co-occurring intellectual disability. And the red line is individuals with autism with co-occurring intellectual disability. So we know that intellectual disability does play a role in this. And usually in typical development, what happens is you get better and better with age and kind of reach this peak level, and then past 60, you might see declines. But what we're seeing in the individuals with autism is this premature plateau that's occurring in adolescence. And what's really striking about this is if you compare this trajectory to people with Down syndrome, there is just this constant climb that's occurring across age. So they're not experiencing this kind of premature adolescent plateau. So this group has looked at a number of the different contextual factors that may lead to this type of adolescent plateau in the autism group. But one of the questions that I had, knowing that motor performance plateaus in adolescence as well, is that plateau in motor skill somehow associated with these adaptive daily living skill plateaus that we're also seeing? So what are the implications of motor impairments, and what is there in the literature? So we do know that in preschoolers with autism, sensory and motor difficulties were found to be correlated with adaptive daily living skills, but we don't really know what happens after preschool. We do know that in typically developing individuals, midlife maximum grip strength is actually predictive of functional limitations and even mortality up to 25 years later. And there's actually a number of studies that have shown this. And they've looked for other factors like BMI, weight, cardiovascular health to try to explain this, but it still is actually able to account for a lot of the differences and changes in functional limitations and mortality. So it seems like grip strength may be a particularly important measure to look at in individuals with autism. And I say that as a researcher to you guys, many of whom are clinicians who have known this for a really long time, right? Like the OTs in the audience are probably going, yeah, we've known this. So here's just kind of a summary of what we know from the slides that I just showed you. So cross-sectionally, there really appears to be this widening gap in the motor skills between groups of people with autism and people with typical development with age. But one of the challenges is we don't know what happens longitudinally. And it's really important to have longitudinal data in there because we don't know if these age-related changes are due to cohort effects or are actually the developmental trajectory that an individual might experience. Another thing is that in autism, we know that adolescents plateau in their activities of daily living skill development, but do motor skills contribute to this plateau? Or do motor skills have anything to do with activities of daily living in autism? And then finally, in preschool, sensory motor relations were found with activities of daily living skill in autism, but what happens beyond preschool? Because there's a lot of life lived beyond that time. So, our study aims, we had two of them. The first one was to longitudinally examine the developmental trajectory of manual motor performance from early childhood to mid-adulthood in autism. And based on the cross-sectional data, we hypothesized that there would be a typical development of these motor skills with age. Our second aim was to examine manual motor performance as a correlate of both current and future adaptive daily living skills. And because we had the longitudinal data, we could look at whether or not our grip strength measures today could predict our adaptive living skills today and also predict it 8 years into the future. So we hypothesized, just based on the research in preschoolers, that manual motor performance will be associated with adaptive daily living skills. So here's kind of our study design, and this is actually a secondary data analysis from Dr. Janet Lanehart's data set that she collected over now, I think, 12-year period of time at the University of Utah. And the primary objective of that larger study was to really understand brain development from childhood through adulthood in individuals with autism. But very lucky for me, they also collected a couple of motor measures as well that we could examine. So this is a cohort sequential design, and what that means is they started a number of different age cohorts and followed them over a 10-year period of time. So they had a group of 3 to 5-year-olds, a group of 7 to 10-year-olds, on, and then followed them for that 10-year period. There were 4 time points of data collection, and at time 1, time 2, time 3, and time 4, everybody had an MRI scan and a behavioral measure. I say everybody, but there were times where certain people didn't get those measures because they weren't available, et cetera, et cetera. So particular to this study, we had our measures of adaptive daily living skills taken at time 1, time 3, and time 4 using the Vineland-2, particularly the daily living subscale of the Vineland-2. And then we also had measures of finger tapping speed and grip strength that were taken at time 1, time 2, time 3, and time 4. And I don't know if anybody has seen, I did bring along, this grip strength is kind of a proxy, because really to measure grip strength, what we do is we use this measure called a dynamometer, and we have you squeeze it as hard as you possibly can, and it doesn't move, but we can actually look at the force exerted on here. So that's how we measure grip strength. So the participants in this study, it was a study that looked at actually all males with autism with typical development. And we had 90 males with autism and 56 males with typical development. The age range spanned from 6 years of age to 40 years of age. The autism group had pretty much smack dab average IQ as a group, but there was a significant difference in the IQ between the groups because our typically developing group was above 1 standard deviation above the average. So they were kind of a precocious, typically developing group. So in the analyses that I show you, we do control for full-scale IQ measures because there is this difference here. In both groups, right hand was the preferred hand to do these tests with, although there was a greater proportion of right-handers in the typically developing group than in the group with autism, which is consistent with the literature. So once again, these are our study aims. So to first really understand the developmental trajectory of these manual motor performance skills, I first wanted to make sure that our typically developing group in this study was typically developing. So were their grip strength scores similar to what we would expect? And then we also thought, after we determined that the typically developing group was indeed typically developing in our motor skills, we wanted to look at the trajectories of the 2 different groups. So to look at the normative data, there was a paper that very luckily came out right before we went to go analyze these data. And in this paper, they had 60,000 observations of grip strength from 18 months all the way to 90 years of age from 50,000 individuals. And from this, they came up with the different norms, like 50th percentile, 90th percentile, that we would likely see in males versus females. So what I did is I put our typically developing and autism data in this graph and used the same normative curves that we had before. And what we found was that, yay, our typically developing group did have grip strength within the norm. So 50% of our typically developing group had 50th percentile or below, exactly what we would expect. What I didn't expect, and really this was almost a mistake because I decided to just put all of the data up there with the autism and the typically developing group, but I'm happy that I made that mistake because what we also found was that about 1/3 of the autism sample had at least 1 grip strength measurement that was below the 10th percentile. And so very low grip strength compared to the normative data for a subset of these individuals. That said, we do include all the data on here, so you can see here too that we have a couple people with autism who are actually above the 90th percentile as well. So at least 2 individuals. So we know that there's a lot of variability in this. It's not that every person with autism has weak grip strength, but a subset of them did. And this really spans from our 5-year age range all the way to about 35, 40. So it covers the whole age span that we were looking at. So our next step was then to compare the developmental trajectories of our 2 groups in terms of both grip strength and finger tapping speed. I'd also say that there was no normative data for finger tapping speed, so we couldn't check our typically developing finger tapping speed data compared to the norms. So here's what we found with our grip strength data. On the x-axis here we have age, and on our y-axis here we have our grip strength. measurement, and this was the best grip strength that they were able to do with multiple trials on both hands. So regardless of their handedness, it was the maximum force they were able to do. And in blue, we have our our autism group, and in black, we have our typically developing group and all of their longitudinal trajectories and data points. What we see is that starting at 5, the groups are really quite similar in terms of grip strength. But around 15 years of age, there is this atypically early plateau in the autism group that makes this divide wider and wider at 15 years of age and beyond. So another way to examine this data is we looked at group comparisons in those younger than 15 years of age. And what we found was really a small effect size in terms of the group differences. But then when we looked past 15 years of age, we had a quite large effect size for a group difference. So this is just another way to portray that same data. So here, this is looking at the rate of change. So anything above 0 means that the person is improving in their grip strength, and anything that dips below the 0 line means that they're declining in their grip strength. And as we would expect in the typically developing group, there's increases that are happening really all the way to about, 30 years of age, and then there's declines that are starting. But in the autism group, the increases are not as steep, and then the decline happens a little bit earlier. Okay, so we did the exact same thing in finger tapping speed, and here we split out the left versus the right hand, and we found virtually the same results, that as the kids are getting older, there's a widening gap in the motor skills between the autism group and the typically developing group. And here it starts perhaps a little bit earlier than 15, but still pretty close to the 15-year-old age range. But these are statistically significant different trajectories of development that we're seeing. So our second study aim was to then examine manual motor performance as a correlate of both current and future adaptive daily living skills. So just to kind of remind you of our study design, what we wanted to do was look at time 1 grip strength and finger tapping measures and then correlate that with our time 1 daily living skill measures. And then also look at time 1 grip strength and finger tapping measures and look at those in relation to whether it could predict time 4 daily living skills, which was about 8 years into the future. So we did find that the grip strength was correlated with the current daily living skills, and this was after controlling for both age and IQ measurements, because we know that IQ relates to independent function, but even after controlling for age and IQ, we still find this relationship. And I'd like to point out that there's a statistically significant relationship here, and we have a pretty large sample size, but this is a small to medium effect. So just kind of, this is not that, motor skills are going to solve all of this, right? It's a piece of the pie, but we're still finding that it is at least a statistically meaningful piece of the pie. So we also found that grip strength predicted daily living skills 5 to 9 years later, and this is across the entire sample. And then when we looked at just those individuals who are 18 years and older in the adult sample, once again, we found a relationship, even though it's a smaller sample size of those who are just 18 years and older. So overall, we found that a high proportion of individuals with autism had particularly weak grip strength, and really this was from 5 to 40 years of age. We also found that manual motor skills improved but plateaued early in autism, meaning less typical motor skills from adolescence into adulthood. Finally, we found that manual motor performance related to both concurrent and future adaptive daily living skills. Once again, this is a small effect size, but we think that it might be able to account for a little bit of the variability in independent living skills. So some of the implications and future directions. It does seem that individuals with autism are at risk for poorer manual motor skills, which could possibly affect adult outcome and adaptive daily living skills. One question I have is, if the gap is widening in the adolescents and adults, what's happening past mid-adulthood? So we know that in typically developing individuals, we improve in our motor skills, we plateau, and then we start declining. But what's happening in individuals with autism where they're improving, declining earlier, and we only know until 40 years of age with this data set, so we haven't looked past that. So I think this brings up some important questions in terms of aging in autism. One of the major questions I have is, are there ways to prevent the plateau in adolescence? And I guess another way of framing this question is, are there things that we're doing in childhood that might be preventing these gaps from looking wider in childhood? So could it actually be that we might be seeing some of the therapeutic effects for the children who are receiving these services in childhood, but if these services drop off or they change, how does that look over time? So I think that one potential mechanism is that different therapies that a child is receiving may be a protective effect. But if those therapies drop off, we may need to continue those past adolescence and into adulthood. So another question I have is, what are the mechanisms that are driving this? And in this data set, it's a very rich data set, so we've been able to look at a couple of these. One is we've been able to look at different puberty effects, because we thought if this is happening at adolescence, perhaps there's puberty effects and hormonal changes that are driving some of these differences. And this data set has a rich definition of the different pubertal stages that each participant was in when the data was collected. What we found, though, was that it does not predict it at all. So it doesn't seem to be that it's these hormonal changes that are happening. Another question is, are there brain changes that are happening in this? So another study that we did with time 1 of this data found that indeed grip strength was related to the social symptoms in people with autism. But if we were able to take a look at what was happening in the brainstem of those individuals, the brainstem predicted the grip strength measurements, and it predicted the social symptom measurements, and it took away the relationship between the two. And so maybe there's things that are happening in the brain that could be impacting this change over time. Something we're still looking into. There's a lot more to look at there. So it's a vast frontier. So another mechanism that when I've given this talk to other groups, and most recently was a developmental psychology group, is they really wondered about the role of physical activity in people with autism, because we do know that adolescents with autism are particularly less likely to engage in physical activity compared to even children with autism. So now I'm making the transition from the kind of clean, peer-reviewed data to our newer stuff. So bear with me here. But we wanted to see if we could replicate this, and it is a smaller sample size. So we have 22 people with autism in the sample size. And as a very first step, what we did is we wanted to see if our grip strength measurements were able to still predict adaptive daily living skills. But now, instead of the Vineland, we use the Waisman Activities of Daily Living Scale. And I don't know if you guys have used that measure, but it correlates very highly with the Vineland Daily Living Scale scores. Like at a 0.8 level. So it's a really strong correlation, and it's 34 items, which is awesome. So I know that oftentimes we have to talk through the Vineland is one of the trickier measures for parents to fill out for people in our studies, and the Waisman Activities of Daily Living, it kind of seems to make sense to people. So there's a plug for the WADL. So we used the WADL, and we looked at that in terms of grip strength in a smaller sample. And this is actually some analyses that were done by an undergraduate student in my lab as part of her Biology 152 project. And so this was after controlling for age and full-scale IQ. My student Larissa Hacker, she found that indeed grip strength scores were correlated with Waisman Activities of Daily Living Scale total scores. So we were able to replicate that finding that the grip strength does seem to be correlated with the Waisman Activity of Daily Living. Going kind of item by item, it's correlated with the number of the things that you think it might be in terms of being able to prepare food and also dressing-related activities. So then what we did is in the sample, so we had 22 people with autism, 6 to 14 years of age. We also had 20 people with typical development, and we looked at their physical activity hours. So I will say that there are some really beautiful ways to look at physical activity, Fitbits. There's a number of different questionnaires that are very long and very comprehensive. We did not use those, which is a limitation of this study. But what we had is we had the parent estimate how much physical activity they think their child gets in school, and then how much physical activity they think their child gets outside of school, and we gave them a list of different things that we counted as physical activity. And what we found was that on a weekly basis, the group with typical development had a lot more physical activity, a significantly different amount of physical activity than the group with autism. But I would also like to point out, and I'm a huge proponent of showing the individual differences, that we have a really wide range within the autism group that I don't think is always, when you just see the mean differences of the groups, is not always represented. And so what I wondered then was, if we took advantage of this range, would that be able to explain the relationship between the WADL that we were seeing in grip strength measurements? So some of the second year Masters in OT students who I've been working with really thought that, wouldn't it be amazing if we just introduced more physical activity, if the relationship between the grip strength measures and the Waisman activity of daily living skills would kind of just go away. So could we improve adaptive daily living skills and grip strength just through improving physical activity? And so they went to go do those analyses, and it doesn't seem to be the case. So even in the high activity group is in pink, the low activity group is in green, and the medium activity group is in blue. And while there's slightly different changes in this, we don't see a group difference, and it's a really small effect size, corresponding to a p-value of like 0.8. So I think that even if we were to get a larger sample than just 22, which is a limitation of this, is the smaller sample size, we would still probably see, just probably the same effect. So physical activity does not seem to moderate or explain this relationship between grip strength and adaptive daily living skills. Although I still think in terms of, from the neuroscience perspective, physical activity is a great way to promote just general brain health. So yes, physical activity did not appear to really make a difference in this relationship. So overall, we know that there's a number of context variables like schoolwork, independent vocation, and high-quality relationships with family that have been shown to lead to improvements in the core autism features into adulthood. But the present study reflects that motor ability may also play a small role, but important role, in predicting adult outcomes in ASD. And really, when I look at this data, I think, are there ways that we can improve some of these manual motor skills just to make it that much easier to do some of these different tasks, or chores, as we oftentimes think of with activities of daily living? And then, are there ways to enhance motor skills in this population across the lifespan? So a lot of focus that I know of is focused on children motor skills, but in adolescence and adulthood, there may not be that same emphasis. And I wonder if the Ming and colleagues' finding of the different healthcare charts and showing that adolescents with autism didn't have as many motor concerns in their charts as the children with autism is not so much an improvement over time, but just that practitioners are not looking for some of these motor difficulties in these individuals. I don't know. It's something to look at. So I wanted to say thank you to the participants and their families, to the many people who contributed to the longitudinal project, to the amazing collaborators and the students in my lab and the agency that have helped fund this research. But I really want to have your thoughts on kind of these data, because I still don't know why we would see such a differential gap in the motor skills and these very fundamental motor skills in adolescence. So thank you. Yeah.
So the first question I had from the beginning of the talk had to do with
Yeah.
And then I'm also thinking about motor coordination is a huge factor in and of itself in autism. So I don't know if you have any information on that. Is that something you're interested in?
Yes. So for those of, I'm not sure if everybody could hear it, but Gail was asking about fine versus gross motor coordination, and I think what you're bringing to light is really this is just a small piece of the motor pie, right? Like, can you squeeze and can you tap quickly? And so it may not be a full picture of what a child is capable of. In fact, I would say it's undoubtedly not a clear picture of what the child is capable of. We have been using, in the data that we're collecting currently, some of the more standardized batteries of motor performance, like the Brunings-Osareski test of motor proficiency, and that looks at both the fine motor and the gross motor skills. Some of the tasks include being able to switch pennies from one hand to the other, so perhaps some of those, kind of movements towards the midline and bilateral coordination pieces. It also has postural stability, and also even we make them do sit-ups and push-ups. So if you ever walk past our lab and see people, poor kids with autism, doing push-ups and sit-ups, that's, you're in the right place. So when we're looking at that, we can get a percentile measure of their abilities, both in terms of the fine and the gross motor. We have collected data in 20 individuals with autism so far, so that's a really small sample to be able to kind of look at. But their percentile scores in terms of the motor performance measures are very, very different. So for a manuscript that I'm preparing right now, the range in the percentile scores from the BOT 2 for the autism group was between 4th percentile and 50th percentile. So 50th was the highest that any of our participants got. The range in the typically developing group was 58th percentile to 115th, or I'm sorry, that was the standard score. It was to 98th percentile. So even the fact that none of the individuals were overlapping in that data really seemed to suggest that there are these pretty big motor differences even when we are looking at fine and gross motor scores kind of pulled together.
Are you able to look at those independently and see if one of them is more, like, is fine motor more associated with?
Yes, that's a really good question. So is fine motor or gross motor perhaps more associated with these things in people with autism? We do have that ability. I have not run those analyses, but that's actually a really exciting analysis to run. Another thing that we want is we do have some of the brain imaging data as well, so to see what areas of the brain are really related to some of the fine motor differences that we're seeing and some of the gross motor differences that we're seeing. And I think your question speaks to, correct me if I'm wrong, but just the individual differences that we can even see within a child, where one child may really excel at some of these fine motor tasks, but may have difficulty with postural control, whereas another child with autism may do really great with postural control tasks, but maybe not so well in other domains.
Yeah, and I always wonder for research when we put all those together, if you have a lot of split skills in autism, and so if you have above average skill in one area and below in another, is that going to look more midline?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. Where there's so many individual differences in autism, and basic statistics tell you that when you have so much variability or outliers in these domains, perhaps a mean isn't the best way to look at these things, and you can look at medians or other techniques. And that's actually why I really strive to put all of the individuals on the plots that we have, just so that people can really see what's happening in the individuals and the variability that we're seeing. But I do think that when we just do group averages and then compare them and say, well, there's a difference, that we're very limited in what we can say and what that means on an individual basis. Maria?
I was wondering a little bit about cerebral palsy because we've shown that kids with CP are about 8 times more likely than other children to develop autism. So there is this relationship. Still, the vast majority don't have autism. And then I'm just wondering, it kind of speaks to your question of possible individual subgroup. Could there be subgroups within the autism group that have a very mild CP type thing going on that could bring down those averages?
No, I think that's a really excellent thought. And when we had our brainstem imaging as well, showing that that was part of the area that was driving the relationships between the motor symptoms and the social severity symptoms, I immediately thought of CP as well. It would be really interesting, I think, to examine some of these motor skills in CP and autism. One of the criticisms of looking at motor skills in autism is that motor difficulties are not unique to autism. And people say, well, why study these? We know that kids with Down syndrome have motor difficulties, kids with CP, that's part of their diagnostic criteria is having these motor difficulties, so why do this in autism? My hope is that we can try to use these skills as a way to better understand autism in relation to other developmental disorders, as I do think that there might be, as the prevalence data suggests, there might be quite a bit of overlap in these profiles.
I wondered about laterality. Did you say when you did grade strength on both sides?
We did it on both sides, and we just took the maximum value, whichever it was, and we did multiple trials on both sides. And that was based on what the normative data plots were done, and just kind of giving them the benefit of the doubt, especially because we know that there are laterality difference and handedness difference in autism and also in this larger sample. And we think that that might have something to do with what's happening in the brain as well. I do think it's interesting, you guys will permit me, to go back to the finger tapping data, because we did keep those separate because there was no normative data on that. And you can see that the biggest differences are in the preferred hand compared to the non-preferred hand. So here's the preferred hand, and then here's the non-preferred hand. So bigger differences, just kind of eyeballing it, are there in terms of the statistics as well. Yeah, Mary?
So one question I have is, the Vineland is expansive, as you mentioned, lots of questions, and as you're moving up in ages, are you pulling items out from that are more would you consider your basic ADLs versus more complex, or are you using the whole scale? Because as we know, sometimes people, it's not so much that they're declining as much as they're not keeping pace with the complexity that's demanded at an older age or expected at an older age.
Yeah.
If you had any thoughts on that?
No, that's a really good point. So to answer your first question, we are just using the Vineland and not in respect to the different complexities. This is in keeping in line with the comparability with previous research that has used the Vineland as this type of measure of adaptive daily living skill. But I totally agree with you that being able to dress yourself at age 3 is very different than at age 20. And so can we take a look at the meaningfulness of these different things? Because it'll mean something very different if a 3-year-old can't do it versus a 25-year-old. To get to that, I've actually found that finding dressing measures has been particularly challenging. That might just be that I don't know exactly where to look, because in my psychology training we never address dressing, but but I'm picking it up. And so what we are doing in our lab currently, because we're interested in pre-post differences in dressing as a result of postural stability training, is we have a kinematic analysis of people dressing in a clear rain suit, so putting a clear rain suit over clothing, and then seeing, we have the postural stability measure, so the Wii balance is tracking them as they dress, and then we also have the Kinect camera, which tells us the values of the X, Y, and Z coordinates of the 16 joint coordinates in their body. And so what we're doing is trying to see if there are differences in how that kinematic data look before and then how it looks after. We just did a feasibility study out of it to see how many kids were able to actually do the task as instructed, which is dressing. And these are clear rain suit pants and a shirt without any supports, without using wall supports or stepping off of the balance board. And we actually found that it was 50% at the beginning of the study. It was 50-50 both in our typically developing group and our group with autism. But after the training, there was 80%. So we're kind of looking at that. And those who were able to dress, that was predicted by their Brunings-Osoretsky Postural Stability Standardized Measure score. So we think that it is perhaps related to balance. But going back to your point, I think that we do need to have better measures of how meaningful are these tasks. And one of the major limitations of this is they're asked to finger tap. Like, what does that mean to them? It doesn't, they aren't going to win candy or money or, be able to achieve some of these goals by tapping their finger as quickly as possible. So having more meaningful tasks and being able to measure those in a continuous way, I think is a really important step for the research literature to move forward in.
The other thought I had is, I work at the preschool level, so I don't work at the first through, high school level, but when I look at the proportion of time our preschoolers are spending on things like Play-Doh and manipulatives and constructive play and the proportion of their day that's spent with lots and lots of manipulative hand skills at their level, when I think about older kids and how much in their school day involves Play-Doh, I don't think much in 6th grade. How much of their school day involves building with constructive manipulatives? Not much. So not that we have typically developing people, but it may be like a use it or lose it kind of thing, whereas in typically developing people, even if you don't do that often, if you have to recruit that, you can call back your skills. But maybe in some of our individuals with autism, when as they get into the older ages and they're doing less proportion of those kinds of activities that involve dexterity and strength combined with coordination as a proportion of their day, they almost lose the ability to go back and recruit those motor skills or remember those motor skills or plan those motor skills. They're spending a lot of time in other tasks, ABA tasks, as well as their day just doesn't include that type of activity anymore. And ours as adults, why can't we all play with Play-Doh in high school? But we can recruit it back, but they may not be able to.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting thought, because when we look at just what are the occupations or the things that people with autism participate in, particularly in adolescence, the number one thing that tends to come up is video gaming. And in many ways, when I watch kids with autism play video games, it's remarkable. And so trying to figure out, and I thought maybe the finger tapping thing would be able to tap into a little bit of that, because that's kind of what you're doing, right? Is you're trying to do it quickly. But it is interesting to think about, in typically developing individuals, what are typically developing individuals doing in adolescence that requires hand manipulation? And I think a lot of it might be sports related. I don't know. I'm just conjecturing at this point.
Texting, typing.
Writing, texting, typing. Yeah, so a lot of these technology-based types of things. But I think that, particularly with the technology-based types of things, a lot of individuals with autism are more prone to do some of those things too. But it's the, group athletics, it's the baseball, it's some of those things that you may not have those skills.
So two thoughts related to what you're saying. One is I can relate to adolescents with autism having plenty of practice with manual skills. But if we're thinking about practice being a factor, you were also talking about postural control and non-manual, right? The relationship between perhaps those other skills and manual. And I think it's probably likely that adolescents with autism are less involved. I certainly, from an NF1, it's harder to actually have your child who's 15 be participating in a group sport when group sport suddenly became a sport.
Yeah.
Team competitive. It's really hard, even with things like Special Olympics, or whatever it is. Kids with autism generally don't qualify for that because it's an intellectual disability, and then the opportunities to practice and be involved might be less frequent. So that's one thought. So practice not just of manual skills, but of other gross motor and postural control things. And the second, I couldn't help but be curious about the motivation for kids to do those activities, and motivation and capacity to understand or attend within the period of time you needed to attend to measure this. And I didn't know if there were any, maybe the only kids in that study from Janet were kids who were higher functioning. I don't know.
Yeah. So all of these kids had to do, and I say kids, but it really was from 5 to 30. Or 5 to 40, all of them had to do the brain imaging piece too, so that's a select sample of these individuals. Interestingly enough, when I started out looking at motor things in autism, people thought it was only in the individuals who had co-occurring intellectual disability. But now we're seeing that it's actually, really across the spectrum that we're seeing these things. I think it's interesting that you bring up the motivation piece, because whenever I would do cognitive learning types of things in autism, I would never get a review or comment on motivation. But with motor stuff, oftentimes I hear this motivation piece coming in. And so the reviewer for this paper wanted to know whether or not I had had control tasks to show that these people were motivated to continue in the study. And I said, well, we didn't consider the brain imaging and the neuropsych testing and the hours and hours of IQ testing to be indicative of motivation, and they probably should not be indicative of motivation, but these are individuals who are very committed to this study. Whether or not, squeezing was a motivation thing, I don't know. I know in our lab, a lot of the kids get really excited to see their strength kind of thing, and even the adolescents, they kind of, get excited about it, and we make a big deal about it. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's interesting because cognitively, nobody has ever asked me about whether or not the child was motivated to take the IQ test, which I will tell you most of them have not been in both groups. But in terms of the motor stuff, I do think that sometimes we often associate motor things with leisure and with things that are motivating to us. And so, but I'm not sure if that's the case in autism, or maybe they're less motivated to do motor stuff, I don't know, or kind of demonstrate their motor skills. So I do think it's a good question. Yeah, Joan?
Wouldn't there be an individual difference in motivation? So, across the board, you really couldn't say, well, I guess you could if you had to weigh the data, but I also think that motivation it's very individual.
Mm-hmm.
Kids with autism have different motivators. So I think that's an interesting avenue to look at.
Yeah, I agree.
The other question I was wondering about, those few people with autism who scored in the high, what are the characteristics? What do we know about them?
Yeah, so we looked, they were no different from the average group in IQ, but they were in adaptive daily living skills. So they were but that kind of was bore out in our correlations too, so that wasn't too surprising to us. But in any of the other demographic variables, we didn't find any difference with them.
And an MRI?
We have not looked at the MRI data with them, but that would be interesting to look at as well.
Because you wonder about that, with kids in terms of resilience. Why do some kids thrive in really difficult situations and other kids don't?
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting to think about that resilience piece in reference to this, because we know that at the group level, there's this propensity to plateau early in motor skills. But we have a couple of those outstanding individuals who are just absolutely rocking it, right?
Something is different.
Yeah, absolutely. Something is definitely different. But I haven't looked at the brain imaging data, but I think that's a really exciting analysis to run. Thank you. Yeah, Brittany.
I was curious in your thoughts about the directionality of the relationship between the manual motor performance and the daily living skills. So the way that for some reason, the way you presented it, I was thinking in terms of, issues with manual motor performance or decreased grip strength kind of causing, I know correlation can't speak to that, but causing issues with daily living skills, right? But then isn't it also possible that not completing these daily living skills every day over and over, whether it's a beginner code or, really things like that actually do require fine motor skills? Like, if there's something to be said about that relationship going both ways. So I was just curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think that it could be going both ways. And if, I think about the amount of practice that a person has with those adaptive daily living tasks and feeling like you have that kind of mastery over those types of things. And if you don't, and you look around you and everybody else around you does, that kind of stinks, right? And you aren't that motivated to do it. So kind of getting back to that motivation piece, you're exactly right that it could be the adaptive daily living difficulties that are causing the motor difficulties, or it could be that at different time points they're kind of interacting with each other to create this motor picture that we're seeing. I don't know. And with the longitudinal data, we can kind of get a better sense of that, so I was able to predict it 8 years out, but we don't have a full picture of that. I do know out of the University of North Carolina, I know they presented this at MFAR, but I don't know if they've published it yet. But they did find that adaptive daily living skills at 3 years of age in children with autism was the best predictor of employment and adult outcomes.
Any other questions?
Yeah, so following up on these high performers, so did they tend to stay high? There weren't enough of the really high ones, I guess, to see a clear trend. Did they tend to stay high?
It was the higher performers that we only had a couple of data points for, and I mean there was only 2 of them, so we don't know whether or not they stayed high.
So you always tell me one of the defining characteristics of autism is the uneven profile against all of the domains. Did you find that these motor skills were more predictive than some other measures of their skills in other domains, or is it about the same?
That's a really good question. So I think that kind of gets back to Gail's question about the uneven motor profile that a child may have, like fine versus gross motor impairments. But with the measurements that we have in this study, I don't think we can really speak to that because the finger tapping and the grip strength are just such small pieces of the broader puzzle of what's happening in motor, like let alone bigger cognitive things.
So in general, were the ones with the high motor skills, did they tend to have higher levels of social skills, the higher communication skills, or it was completely unpredictable?
At time 1, they had higher social skills, but we don't know past that.
And in general, so you didn't find a correlation with the indicators of the onset of adolescence. So you didn't see that the inflection point in their trend was associated with the onset of puberty?
Correct.
You don't see a correlation like you do in schizophrenia or bipolar where the symptom profile changes with the onset of adolescence. You didn't see evidence for that.
We didn't see, that at least the puberty aspect of it was associated or explained why there was this widening gap.
Thank you, Brittany.
Well, thank you. Really appreciate it.